because obviously these people are all here before the start time. And knowing how things work at the journalism school, most people trickle in between.
I'm a big fan of Delray Beach. My grandparents lived nearby.
Oh, cool. Yeah, well, then you know Atlantic Avenue and all those good restaurants probably.
Yes.
All that
Yes.
fun stuff. Well, it's just turning 5 o'clock now and we're recording. So I say we go ahead and get started, and we're certainly going to have people trickling in. They always do in the first J school. You know, we like to be as prompt as possible, but we've learned after a year at this school that everyone's a little bit tardy. But first of all, Alex, thank you so much for speaking with us. I think everybody here knows, and I'm nervous to introduce you too early because I want, more people to hear the benefit of your introduction. But certainly everybody who's come to this knows who you are. You're the managing editor of CNN Business. And we're all incredibly grateful at the journalism school that you would make time to do this during probably, I'm guessing, one of the busiest news cycles, if not the busiest, that you've ever managed and led. Can you tell us a little bit about what this has been like for you?
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying I'm, and this goes to that I am trying to brave this without headphones. So it is possible that you all may hear my 3-year-old either crying, or I believe just now he was trying to roar.
We forgive you. Listen, people are making it work, and we're improvising during this age of Zoom. So if the ceiling caves in, that might be the only thing that we would worry about you for. But noise in the background, all of that is forgiven.
Yeah. Also, if there is noise in the background, it will at least be better than the meeting I had with one of my teams yesterday, in which my cat decided that he would just hang out and also have his butt facing the camera the whole time. So
great.
Yeah. So this has been quite an interesting time to be working in news, and I mean interesting in all the good and bad ways. It's also it's a challenge because what we sort of have to, there are a lot of things you have to balance all at once. How do you deal, we had an idea for what 2020 was going to look like for our newsroom, and what our priorities were going to be, and what we were going to be covering, and what we were going to be caring about. Mm-hmm. And then it all changed in a few weeks. We did have a preview of what would happen because we have a bureau in Hong Kong. So they have been dealing with this for even longer than we have. And it was also nice for us in that we sort of were able to talk to them early on and say, okay, how do you do this without going insane? And get some good advice from them. But it's a constant and interesting challenge of figuring out, this story is changing so fast. How do you prioritize week to week? What are the stories we care about this week? What are the stories we're going to try to jump on? What are the stories that sort of feel like last week? So for instance, we've stopped as much doing the individual stories of individual company announces layoffs, because what we found is that our readers, at a certain point it becomes the same, like we all know the story. And so it's the sort of bigger picture, different kinds of stories rather than just the straight news about company X announces layoffs that we're focusing on now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I've heard a couple of people have to sort of adapt their standard coverage because the scope of the stories or the frequency of the stories is changing. And as I suspected, you can see the numbers are going up and up and up. So I just want to take a second to welcome everyone who's joining or will be joining or watching this retroactively. It's great to be here with Alex Koppelman, the managing editor of CNN Business, and welcome to our students and faculty here at Columbia Journalism. Of course, you all know me, who's pestered you over the course of the year. But this has been one of the most exciting ways we could think in an otherwise stressful and somewhat disappointing 2 months to end our year by having someone like Alex take time to talk to us. So Alex, thank you. Let's backtrack a little bit now that we've got sort of the critical mass of a group of young future editors who want to be following in your footsteps, to ask a little bit about how you came to CNN and how you came to journalism. I know before this you were editing at The Guardian, at The New Yorker, but how did you come to the profession, and what's your story and how you ended up in your current role?
So how did I come to the profession? I kept making the mistake of changing my major in college and picking my classes when I wasn't entirely sober. And finally I went from like, I'll major in political science. I'll be a lawyer. I'll be a teacher. Oh, I know, I'll be a journalist. And somehow that one was the one that stuck, and possibly my worst idea, but we went with it, and it has turned out pretty well.
Seems to have done. And you went
Yeah,
to UPenn, right?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
And from there, got into journalism. My first year, which I'll skip through pretty quickly, but just for a sense for you all as to how like getting into, or I imagine for some of you back into a career can in some ways be about luck. I I had a few jobs coming out of college, none of which were like entirely paid the bills, but the one that sort of propelled my career happened because I needed a new wallet, and I went and bought a new wallet, and I was cleaning out the old one and found in the old one a business card for another Penn grad who had been on the board of the Daily Pennsylvanian, which I had worked on. Uh, and he was at the time the restaurant critic, or a restaurant critic for Time Out, which I was interested in writing for. So I emailed him and said, could you give me some advice? And he said, yeah, why don't you come into the magazine company I run to talk with me? And instead of getting advice on how to write for Time Out, in about 15 minutes, he was like, hey, do you want to be an editorial assistant here? So that's how I got my start. Getting to CNN, I had just left my previous job at Vocative and was looking around and had some time to think about what I wanted to do next. And in part, a few things went into it. One of which was I had been my previous job at Vocative. I was sort of taking a big stab up, and also knew that I was taking a risk at a startup that I didn't know what it would be like, but also felt like I could do that because I didn't have a kid yet, and that it was a good time to take something, knowing that it might all blow up. And then when I was looking for a new job, my wife was pregnant. And I was thinking about, so among other things, I was thinking about what would be stable, and I knew CNN would be in. And also I started at CNN as media editor. This was in about June of 2016. And I thought to myself, well, it's going to be an interesting time because the media industry might be going through some things, but rather than just layoffs, which is what it was in like 2009, 2010, it feels like also people are trying to think about what the new thing is, and they have some interesting ideas. And I thought that's what we would be focused on. And also that after the election, no one would care about my section, and I could, sort of roll in at 11, roll out by 4. It'd be great. That's mostly a joke. But no, that we'd be talking about the future of journalism, and that because I was working with really great media reporters like Brian Stelter, Dylan Byers at the time, that I could sort of have a hand in the way we covered media in helping to shape that future in a better way. It turned out that I was completely wrong, and media coverage since 2016 has been entirely about politics, but there you go. So that's what brought me to CNN. And then I started out as senior editor for media, and then became managing editor through a series of promotions that I tried to object to and say, this seems like a bad idea. Why would you do this? And
it sounds like they didn't agree with you with all your
yeah, it was unfortunate for all of us. And yeah, so I currently am managing editor over our media, tech, transportation, consumer, and features teams.
It's a lot of verticals. So how many reporters, if you can share, how many people do you have writing for you that ultimately fall within your purview?
I don't know the exact breakdown offhand. I think I have about 25 people under me, somewhere between 25 and 30, and probably
It's a lot
About
of
20 of those
reporters.
would be reporters.
And you've got people based in Hong Kong, as you say, right? You've got
Yeah,
people.
those are on a different team with a different managing editor. Our managing editor for international, but CNN Business has people in Hong Kong and in London, and I have people in New York, DC, and San Francisco.
I used to work in that Hong Kong bureau, and I wrote
Oh
for
yeah.
CNN Money when it was still CNN Money,
Yes.
which leads me to my next question. The transition from CNN Money to CNN Business, how has that changed the CNN Business nexus, and describe to us CNN Business's place within the broader CNN sort of fishbowl? You know, it's CNN Business is a very formidable digital presence of its own. Where does it fit into the broader organization?
Sure. So the change I think has been a really good one. In part, it was just a good time and something that was probably overdue, in that CNN Money was sort of a legacy of old Time Warner, and we didn't own Time Inc. anymore. We didn't own Money Magazine anymore. It was all, and yet nobody had really said, okay, it doesn't need to be CNN Money anymore. But what happened when we made that switch was we said we need to have more of an identity, and that identity needs to be really great coverage. And so we made an effort to focus on that in a way that personally makes me very happy, and that I think has really been successful, both journalistically and as a business. Our place within CNN, we are a little unique within CNN in that we do, CNN has an operation that feeds news, that reports and feeds news to TV. And we do more of that on our own than some other digital units, though some of them do that as well. So we're really sort of at the center of business coverage for not just digital, but also the TV networks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's sort of interesting that you guys do a lot of enterprise reporting. I think in a lot of other organizations where, the brand has TV first, or TV is sort of the legacy property, CNN, has had a longer presence on air, going back to, I think, 1980, right? Digital has really supported those organizations. So I guess from a business perspective, as a leader, as a manager, how do you see the enterprise work that you do for digital readers? I guess taking the form of almost like an online newspaper, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, that then supplies a lot of really cool original reporting, investigations, breaking news, scoops to broadcast. I mean, broadcast draws heavily on CNN business coverage. We've had Chloe Malas here, who's talked about her investigations into Me Too and Hollywood scandals that have then, been broken on air sometimes. So how do you guys supply a lot of that coverage, and how much would you say they lean on you for that kind of support?
It depends on the day, and it also depends on the network. It's always a conversation. If we think we have a story that TV wants, then we'll be in touch with them and we coordinate. Sometimes it's TV has something that they're interested in, they'll come to us and say, have you done any reporting on this? Can you help us out with this? And I will say, and I'm not just promoting my employer here, but what I have found that is one of the things I really love about CNN is that it is a really collaborative place, and that I can, for instance, when there were stories that involved antitrust issues or something like that in DC, I could call the woman who at the time was running our justice team and say, hey, can you help us out with this? And she'd say, well, we've got 15 different stories coming on Mueller that we're working on today, but yeah, give me 5 minutes and we'll get it done for you. And everybody really is great about that sort of thing. So that's another way in which we fit in.
Now, for you personally, in such a senior editorial position as managing editor, have you done a lot of sort of field reporting or beat reporting over the years that you've been doing this? And the reason I ask is because I'm interested in the intersection between the way a reporter thinks and an editor thinks. And if you yourself have had to adapt and evolve in some of your thinking over time to be able to, the point that I'm trying to set up, and I want people to know over the next sort of 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about editing both on a granular level, editing stories, and editing, meaning being a leader, being a newsroom executive. So I'm curious if you've done sort of some of that reporting and how you've evolved in your thinking over time.
Yeah, so I was a reporter at salon.com for a few years. I ran their political blog for a little while. I was never really a beat reporter, which I think is good because I don't think I would have been a very good beat reporter. I was good as a sort of general assignment reporter. I was good doing second day stories, thinking about like, okay, this happened today. What's the sort of creative, interesting, oddball angle on it for tomorrow? And I was semi-decent as a political blogger. I also wrote some for the New Yorker. That was, again, less beat reporter. But when I was an editor there, if I had something I wanted to write that was probably more of an essay, though I would make some calls and do some research, I would do that. I think what has served me well in my role now is that what I was always better at than beat reporting, I was good at research, especially online, including social network, social profiles, websites, all of that sort of stuff, sort of digging down and finding a little too much detail about people's lives. Which has come in really handy when you're, for instance, helping run coverage of Russian trolls on social media and what they did in 2016 and 2017 and beyond. So my time as a there are times when my time as a reporter has been great, and in some ways almost a little too good, in that like I still find myself going into all the rabbit holes when a reporter of mine has a really great story and I'm really interested and I want to go find out everything about it, which I think sometimes can be really useful as an editor. If you can do some of that reporting alongside them, then it means you have other thoughts and other questions and other avenues to push them on. The problem can be, if you're me, that you have 300 other things to do and suddenly you've spent 2 hours in a rabbit hole looking at 16 different Facebook pages and trying to figure out which one is the mole and which one is not. I think there used to be a way in magazines, people would come up as editorial assistants and then assistant editors and then associate editors and so on and so on and so on. And that was sort of the way you learned how to be an editor. I think that can clearly still be a way to learn how to be an editor. I think being a fact checker is a really good way to be an editor, though those jobs are unfortunately less available than they ever used to be. But I think being a reporter can be a great way to learn how to be an editor, especially if you have really great editors to learn from. And I think some of the best tricks that I use as an editor are things that I learned when I was a reporter, and that all the times when I was really, really annoying to my editor, and then I get the karmic payback for it. I also learned all the ways to deal with a reporter who was that annoying. So it works out.
Do you find that reporters sort of put up a fight when it comes to maintaining a lot of their copy or their reporting, if you try and adjust framing, and I guess the bigger question being, how do you, as an editor, which a lot of people in here, I can see by names in the room, there's people who've studied editing this year, the art, the science of it. How do you do it? How do you have those negotiations with reporters and figure out ways to preserve some of the work they've done, but help them with framing, help them with organization, moving things around, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there are some reporters who do put up a fight, and I actually like reporters who put up a fight. I kind of prefer, I have had reporters who I would give them back, practically a rewrite of their whole story, and they would just be like, this looks great, let's publish it. And I don't want that, because to some extent it almost feels like you don't care. Like, I know my rewrite was fine, but I also know that I probably made mistakes and that there were probably some issues, and I would rather that they say, screw you, this sucks, let's change it. And then we can have that conversation. Then they say, this is great, I don't have anything, it's perfect, let's go. I think navigating that, I don't think there's any one way to deal with a writer, because writers are all different. There are some writers who are brilliant but need their hands held. And part of your job is to say, no, this is great, you're not terrible. And you're like, you've won 4 Pulitzers, what the hell? Why do I need to reassure you? I'm just making this up, but there are people like that. There are some writers who know exactly what they want to say but can't quite say it. There are some writers who that whatever they turn in will be basically perfect, and you'll make 2 copy edits and then you're done. So it changes for all of them, but I think the negotiating is being willing to give on your end too, have the things that are not negotiable, like, and also have the things that where I might say, I don't like your lead, I've come up with a different lead, but I also recognize that it's my lead, and if you have a different or better idea, that's great, let's talk about it. We can't go back to your old lead, I don't like that, we're not publishing that, but that doesn't mean you have to like mine. That sort of give and take, I think, is important, and being willing to compromise. I've heard from some editors who, so one of my, when I'm interviewing editors to hire them, I always ask, what's your pet peeve as an editor? And I don't really have a single answer that I'm looking for necessarily. In part, I just think it's a fun question. I do like to hear, you want me to name just one? Because I think that's important in an editor. Like I like editors to get annoyed by 15 different tiny things, because it means that they're going to spot all those tiny things. But I heard one person say that one of their pet peeves was reporters who came back and reverted edits. And I didn't love hearing that, because I think, we're not perfect. And it should be a give and take. And it's ultimately their byline and their reputation at stake, not necessarily yours.
Well, first of all, on behalf of the reporters who are here, thank you for saying that. I will say that a lot of us at J School are trained really, really well in reporting, but we don't always leave here with the greatest understanding of what it takes to be a senior leader and a senior manager. So we are going to see some good questions or part of the chat, and in a moment we're going to take them, and then I'm hoping we can spend the last 10 or 15 minutes maybe looking at some stories, and some stories to us. And just sort of having a brief chat about those. But I am curious how, or perhaps if you have any sort of words of wisdom or advice for us on how we can develop managerial thinking, and what the parts of your job require in broad strokes that you've had to learn along the way to be a boss, to be a leader, to be able to get people to be motivated and get things done. Not so much, style or editing for content, but how do you run a big newsroom like CNN Business? What have been contrasts or lessons learned? Again, I realize that's a broad question, so if you want to pick 2 or 3 things and sort of share them with us, that advice will be very valuable for people, I think.
Sure. So let me say first that one nice thing is that I don't run the whole newsroom, which is great, because one thing I have struggled with is that, as you rise up the ranks, and this is true in any industry, is you get to do a little less of the thing that you love doing. So I love editing stories. And as I have become more senior, I need to spend less time editing stories. So that's something, that's part of the learning process. Like, there's also a part of the process is knowing that there is a way that I would fix a story. Seeing a story and saying, I could fix this. I don't like it as it is. It's probably fine, but I could make it, 20% better if I just spend 6 hours on it.
6 hours.
Well, whatever number, because, and also, my 6 hours is interrupted by three different things. But yeah, 4 hours, 2 hours, whatever, whether I actually have that time or not. And being willing to say, you know what, I've hired people, it's their job to do this. I can sort of give them a couple notes and let them go and let them do it. And maybe it won't come back the way I would have done it, but it'll come back good. And it's okay for me to go spend time on the other 5 things I should be doing right now. Beyond that, I really do think that one important thing is watching people who manage you, and learning from them what to do and what not to do. There are certain things in both great and not so great managers that I've learned from, things they did well and things they did badly. My first bosses at CNN, I remember being struck by how good they were at just saying thank you. You had a long day today, you did some great work, thank you. You edited so many stories today, thank you. And I haven't necessarily worked in a bunch of, it's not like people were ever like my bosses were ever ungrateful at previous places, but sometimes you just forget to say that. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that would, even if I'm very thankful for something that people have done, it's not necessarily something that have ever necessarily occurred to me before, that I needed to make an effort to specifically say thank you, because I realized when I heard it from them, how good it made me feel. Mm-hmm. And so I immediately tried to take that on and tried to do that. Then there are things like, I had one boss once who I liked very much in many other ways, who my mom had a minor health scare. And I emailed and said, I think she's fine, but just letting you know, I might not be able to cover this this news story as we had planned. I might need to go down to Baltimore, where I'm from. And I never heard back. And so that has always been one thing that I've tried to keep in mind of, there might have been a million different reasons she didn't reply. She might just never have seen it, but it mattered to me very much in that moment. And the things you can do just to make people feel valued, and staying on top of those things is really important. In terms of keeping people motivated, I think, again, it's up to your style. I don't know that I would ever make a great executive, because I don't have that sort of ability to just go around and be positive about everything and do the sort of rah-rah and backslap and wear a Patagonia vest while you do it. My natural mode is probably more disappointed dad. But that works for me, so that's what I go with. And I like to, the relationship I have with a lot of reporters is where we're both, giving each other a decent amount of shit in a fun, friendly way, but it also allows me to say, great job to them. It also allows me to say, hey, listen, this wasn't great. Don't worry about it. We'll make it great. But, I'm a little bit of the disappointed dad right now. And I think that is just, rather than trying to force myself into something I'm not, working to what I am helps me out a little more.
No, I think that's very valuable for people to take away and to remember as professionals. So, first of all, thank you. Some of the questions in the chat are looking really interesting. There's one here from Jalen Martin. He wants to know about some of this Kim Jong-un reporting. And obviously this is very early stages. It's only been out for not even a day. We don't really know what's going on. But he asks, we saw some of this reporting on Kim Jong-un's health. The South Korean government said, we're not so sure. So how does a reporter go about verifying a breaking news story with their editor? I know from having been at CNN covering North Korea several years ago when I was there in Hong Kong, there's a really high standard for how things get out. and there's the row and the triad and lots of different stuff. But if you can walk us through those processes and sort of take us into the newsroom in that regard, I think people would find it very interesting.
Sure. So I can't comment on the North Korea reporting because I wasn't involved in that, so I don't know anything about that
Sure.
specifically. But what I can talk about, yeah, is the sort of general stuff. And well, first let me give sort of a general principle, and then I actually sent you over one story specifically for a reason like this.
Okay.
So my editorial philosophy, and this also goes with my sort of disappointed dad routine, because it is very much me, that I explain to new editors is that the first thing you should do as an editor is assume that everyone else in the world is an idiot. Your reporter is an idiot. Their sources are idiots. The data they're looking at is bad. They're going to fuck their story up in 6 ways. And the only person in the world who can possibly save it is you.
It's a good mentality.
Yeah. And then the second thing you should think is, I'm an idiot. I have fucked up this story in 6 different ways. What are those ways? How do I go out and find out and make sure that I have not screwed up the story when we publish it? Right? So I think that's the first thing. Like, I think that both of those things are really important, and having that sort of skepticism about everything and everyone in a way that's positive and constructive, not like actually telling your reporters that they're idiots and everything they've done is wrong, but looking carefully at their story and asking questions that seem to you and them to be obvious, but asking them anyway. And making, because sometimes it's the obvious stuff that you forget. Like you forget, hey, did you make this one extra call? Did you make this call and ask for comment from this person? Did you ask this expert about this? Those things can make all the difference, as can.
Can I just ask you one? I'm so sorry to interrupt. You bring up a good point that I just want to ask about. How do you create a culture where people are comfortable to admit when they've forgotten important stuff? Because I genuinely think a lot of people feel foolish, you know, when they get asked, did you do this? Did you do that? Especially if it's obvious. They feel like, well, I sound like a moron, so, you know, I'm not so sure I want to be forthcoming about this. How do you make it comfortable for people to say, you know what, thank God you asked that, because I really didn't call that organization. And if we don't put a chance, you know, out there for them to comment, we're in the wrong.
I think that you just have to sort of, I think one thing is to be accepting of that sort of stuff. You know, I was talking to one editor at CNN Business recently who came over from a different publication not long ago, and she had made a mistake in a story and we needed to do a correction. So we did a correction. And to me, it's like, okay, let's just get this correction done. Are we sure right now? Yes. Okay, great. What's the correction language? Okay, that looks good. Let's go. And she said to me afterwards, that was the most respectful correction process I've ever been through. Thank you. And I said, that's nuts. Because people make mistakes. They make mistakes. And if you end up screaming at them over a mistake, then what you end up with is exactly what you're talking about, a culture where people are afraid to admit they made a mistake rather than to come to you and say, you know what, you're right, I didn't make that call, let me go do it right now. You know, it's okay to be, I get annoyed or upset by sloppy mistakes, lazy mistakes. I get annoyed if I've already said to somebody a couple times on different stories, hey, like, be careful of this or that, and then they keep making the same mistake. But other than that, like, people are people and we make mistakes and it's okay. And as long as you're honest about it, then we are fine. And that's just, I think, the best possible attitude to have about it. In terms of, yeah.
No, thank you for answering.
In terms of,
now we can go back to what you were saying.
Sure. So I sent over one story about Amazon that we published recently.
Let me see if I can share.
And I think that's a good example of trying to be, trying to not just focus on what's on the wire and what everybody else is doing.
Can
So
everybody see this? Can you guys see the, Alex, can you see the Amazon story? Did it share properly?
yeah.
Okay, great.
So what helped us here in part is having two really good reporters who were on Amazon and had been on all of this stuff for a little while and had been coming up with some really good stuff. But then what happened was Amazon put out a press release saying, look at all these great things we're doing. And the first reaction at a lot of places is to say, okay, let's do that story about what Amazon says it's doing. But my reporters were then saying to themselves and me, wait, we know this isn't true. We know they're having this problem and that problem and that problem. We can't publish just what they're saying. And so we were probably a little slower than a lot of us would have liked, but what we came out with, rather than a story that just said Amazon says it's doing this, was a really, really good and comprehensive look into this is what Amazon is saying, and this is what is actually happening according to the workers who are experiencing it.
And if I scroll down, not to preempt, if there's anything in particular that you want to share in the story, but I was really struck by this voice here, a job applicant who was looking for a job, and then she sort of walked CNN reporters through what she experienced. 30 to 40 people, they're crammed in a tiny room. There was a bottle of hand sanitizer. I don't know if you classify this as an investigation, but it had what I would perceive as sort of investigative qualities. And I guess that makes sense because you say that you were sort of skeptical about their media report, but this was ambitious reporting to track somebody down like that.
Yeah. And we had, the thing was, what also came together nicely in this situation for us is we had sort of a lot of disparate bits of reporting that the reporters had that were all good and useful and could go in a story, but didn't necessarily make a story by themselves. Mm-hmm. And they sort of came together very nicely in this story because we had that Amazon press release, and it gave a sort of an organizing principle for the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. A frame. Yeah. Is there anything in particular you want me to share with everybody? Some people will have seen this. Some people may be becoming sort of unfamiliar.
No, I think that, this actually, the question is perfect because that really is the reason that I sent it out. It's that the thing you could do, and the thing that a lot of outlets probably did and that we might have done on a different day, is just write up the Amazon press release. Mm-hmm. And it pays to take the extra time and call them out instead when that's what needs to be done.
That's very helpful. Am I back? Did I I've never shared my screen before, so hopefully I did that okay for everybody. So that's really interesting. Let's see, we've got a couple of other questions here that I want to take. We've got one from Kate Webb. She wants to know, what are the greatest challenges for pursuing a journalism career right now in the job climate and our political environment? I would love to make this a very utilitarian question about jobs. I know a lot of people watching this are graduating soon, our class is graduating, and the hot topic is sort of where do we go from here given how the virus has interrupted things. So if you could share a little bit about how it's impacted your hiring process, and if you think there's any general advice people should deploy as they make their next step into their journalism career in this sort of anomalous time, I think that would be helpful for people.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, I don't have great news right now. I think, CNN, we're lucky in that we are at a really stable, I'm lucky in that I'm at a really stable place and at a place that is less dependent on advertising dollars. So I'm not worried for my job right now. There are a lot of journalists who are, and I think what you're seeing right now is a weird phenomenon where there's as much or more reader interest in what all of us are doing than ever, but just getting the traffic doesn't matter if nobody's paying you for that traffic. And that's what's happening in a lot of places. Just getting those readers in a print publication doesn't matter if nobody's paying you for those readers. And that's what you're seeing across the country, where restaurants, concert venues, movie theaters, all these places that were that advertise in local outlets aren't open. And so they have nothing to advertise. And it's not a great situation. I think the best advice I can give all of you, especially right now, is that learning something about the media business can be really valuable for your career. And I worked for a little while at Adweek during its brief relaunch under Michael Wolff, who used to go crazy about how many reporters had no idea who ran the big advertising companies. Because those big advertising companies essentially sign all of our paychecks. Now, I do not know who runs the big advertising companies right now, but I have at least learned how the media business operates. And that allows me, when I'm thinking about jobs, my next step, where I want to be, whether I want to stay at a place or go somewhere else, all of that, to think about, is this place, does it have a sustainable business model? Is it still going to be around? Is it making money? Are they going to lay me off a month after I get there? It also helps you as an editor and manager. You know, there are very good reasons why there is separation between the business side of things and the editorial side of things. And I would never make a judgment about something. I would never make a judgment about a story to satisfy an advertiser or a funder or anything like that. But I will think about, what kind of things do we need to be doing in order to have a sustainable business, and for me to have a job, and for my reporters and editors to have jobs. So for instance, one thing I'm thinking a lot about right now is, and that gets thought about a lot at CNN and other outlets, is, and pre-coronavirus, post-coronavirus, I think this will be true regardless, there's been a lot of obsession at digital outlets about traffic and scale, right? You know, if you get 100 million page views, then you can get a ton of money for those things. But the problem is, first of all, it was never a ton of money for that 100 million page views. And secondly, the amount of money they're paying you per page view is going down and down and down. So purely getting scale isn't that valuable anymore. What has become more valuable is quality content, and what can be sold against that for a higher CPM, that is basically a higher price. So knowing that helps inform what I do and what I think about and what my goals for my team are, including what, you know, I think of the goals of my teams within CNN Business as in part we're about getting the traffic, but in part what we're about is figuring out how to make a sustainable digital business, and how to do it with quality journalism. So one thing I try to think about is that there are, and again, you know, I should emphasize, this is not me being a unique and brilliant genius. This is me having learned from smart people at other jobs too, that there are certain stories for which there might never be a huge mass audience. You know, CNN has an incredibly big audience. There are pieces where we can publish them and millions of people will read them. And it's incredible to see. It's an incredible feeling. Not every story is going to get that. There are some stories that we might publish that there are only 50,000 people in the entire world who care about that story. And what I want to do is make sure I've got in every single one of those 50,000, and I'll consider that a success. So I think about that in terms of, if I can get those 50,000, if they learn that CNN Business is a good place to come to for that content, for that subject that they're interested in, then they'll come back. And that's the kind of reader who is more valuable to us in building a sustainable business. So that's how I sort of meld the two, and why I think it's important to know at least a little bit about how your business runs and how your paycheck happens, because it helps you be smarter about what you do and why you do it, and how you can do the things you want to do in a way that still makes sure everybody gets paid.
That's fascinating. So in a way, it sounds like the investment of reporting and time is a long-term investment in audience development, not just an investment in covering the obligatory stories that you feel you need to cover. That's really kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a reason that everybody in who cares about business reads the Wall Street Journal. And it's because the Wall Street Journal has really, really good business coverage with really good reporters, and showing that we're on the same level, and getting people to come back to our website again and again for similarly good coverage, is part of the goal here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm curious about where you see the election coming back and becoming more resurgent in the national zeitgeist. It may take some time, or it may just naturally bubble up to the surface again. It really feels like it's fallen off the wayside at the moment because this reporting cycle, I mean, even the shooting in Canada didn't have nearly the oxygen that it would have done on an ordinary day, because we're living in a truly bizarre time. So how do we eventually dig ourselves out of this news cycle? Is it going to sort of dictate itself for us? Do we not really have any antecedents to look for? And when does the election become the dominant discourse of the moment? Because I would argue that in an ordinary election year by now, this would be like the big story. We've got the presumptive Democratic nominee. We've got, both sides really heating up. So how do you see that playing out?
I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, that's the best answer I can give you. I have no idea. I think this is such a weird time and situation that it really is hard to say, and it all depends on what the situation in the country is with the virus in a month, 2 months, and so on. I think probably, given normal patterns, what we'll see is that the interest in politics sort of dies down a little bit once you've got candidates, and then picks back up after the conventions, in part probably just due to the fact that people care a little less. They want to go to the beach instead of think about politics for a little while during the summer. But is that going to happen this year? I got no idea. I really don't. And I think it's hard to say how anything breaks through right now, and also how you can cover an election, how everybody can cover an election while staying at home, and how you can participate in an election while staying from home. So it's hard.
Yeah, no, I think nobody really can read the future. I see two interesting questions. One is and just a reminder for people, now's the time, because we're going to go for about 13, 14 more minutes, and then we're going to let Alex go back to running CNN Business. So if you want to get a question in the chat, I would say seize the moment. But there's a question from Kenneth Preston. He's curious about how you can mitigate. I mean, look, reporters are people too, right? And they have emotions and they have feelings, even though to the best of our ability, we try to remain neutral as much as we can and objective. But when President Trump, alienates journalism as a profession, blames it for being sort of this national cancer, an enemy of the people, does it make it harder for reporters to then go and cover him? I know you must have people, even though you're not running the politics desk, who are covering Trump, and Trump bleeds into, I would say, a majority of business stories, I would think, on some level. How do you control impulses, and how are you able to take, I would assume, sort of a neutral tone or a neutral track in responding to these attacks, so that it doesn't somehow throw or mitigate the quality of the journalism that you guys produce on the White House?
Yeah. So I don't think that what he says really affects reporters so much. I don't know how many other reporters and editors will agree with me, but that's what I think. I think one thing that we should be concerned about is the lawsuits that his campaign has filed, which I think experts will tell you don't seem to have a lot of merit, but can scare, post Gawker. You look at a littler newsroom, at a local newsroom that doesn't necessarily have the resources for a long legal battle or for a judgment that goes against them initially. And you can intimidate some newsrooms that might not seem like they matter as much because they're smaller, but that have an outsized impact because they're the one local source of news, for instance. I do not about Trump specifically, but one thing I do think about with my reporters is the amount of trolling that they get for certain stories. Reporting on Alex Jones, for instance, my reporters get harassed over that, or there are certain other people online. So one thing I always try to think about and to be upfront with them about, especially if they haven't covered a particularly controversial person or a person who tends to have fans who go bombard people online, is to say in advance, hey, do you know what's coming? Let's talk through this. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you good with this? And afterwards, are you okay? Do you need anything? How can we help? It's not easy. I found as a reporter and as a blogger, getting comments all the time, some of which were very negative, that they didn't bother me so long as I knew they were wrong, or that they were just crazy. There was one who very respectfully, I thought, referred to me repeatedly as Mr. Dickhead. That one.
Emphasis on the Mr.
Yeah. That one I will treasure forever. The ones that I felt like had some little bit of truth to them were the ones that really got to me. But I was also lucky in that this was pre-Twitter. So I was getting 30 comments rather than notifications for a whole weekend about every single person in my mentions telling me 5,000 times what a horrible person I am, or trying to share my phone number or do something like that. So that's the thing I think about more, really.
It's very tough out there for people now. There's a question, this is sort of interesting, from Laura. You talked about the Wall Street Journal. I wonder if you're comfortable sharing with us how you differentiate yourself. I mean, this question really pertains to the Journal, but I would say more broadly from other online news outlets covering business. How do you keep an edge, and how do you keep some space between you and the competition?
Yeah, well, so Laura, I thought your question was really good. And it's funny because I was talking about this with a friend at another publication today. Your question of what's the competitive advantage of my team from compared to the Journal. I think, look, we're both great publications. The Journal has more reporters focused solely on business. So they can throw more reporters at a given story than I can. There is a way in which you can look at that and say, that's a disadvantage, we're never going to get over that, and you can just bemoan that. Or you can say, you know what, in some ways that's an advantage, because you can say, I don't need to be them. I don't need to try to compete with them. I'm not going to try to compete with them on their field, on their terms, because if I do, I'm just going to lose. And what it frees you up to do is go off and do the thing that's a little different, that can be your own and can be distinctive, and where you can own a different story than what they might focus on, or do something in a different way than your competitors might focus on. And I think that's true at any publication, but in some ways, like being something that being able to think about it that way and say, you know what, we don't have to do this story. We don't have to cover this thing. We can instead try to go off and do the thing that we're better at, or that we've got a really great reporter on, or that somebody else hasn't noticed yet, is freeing in some ways, and can lead to really good stuff.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Very quick last question. It's just about workflow. I'm always interested in how editors manage teams. And, you know, I've been on teams at Dow Jones, and I was sort of familiar with how things work when I was at CNN in 2016. How do you keep track of such an expansive number of reporters and verticals? Do you have an internal sched that you use? Do people pitch every day and then you greenlight the pitches, or do deputy editors do that? Just like the general overview of how you keep the well-oiled machine moving would be sort of interesting.
Well-oiled is generous, thank you. Especially when it, you know, like I like to say about myself. Look, you know, I think one important thing as a manager is knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. And what I like to say about myself is that what I'm, you know, if you bring by a train, I can point to it and say, hey, you know, you might want to put a new coat of paint on that train. You might want to look at your engine, it's about to explode, holy shit. But keeping the trains running on time isn't necessarily my skill set. So fortunately, there are other people who are great at that. How do we make things work? You know, to some extent, because we're so focused on news, a lot of what we do is sort of keep tabs on the news and respond to that. In terms of planning in advance, we have somebody who is really good who helps us do that. And then we sort of rely on our editors to keep tabs on all of the reporters. And one thing at CNN, because we're such a big organization spread out over so many people in so many places, is, you know, over communication is a really good thing. You know, just a lot of emails saying, this is what we're doing, this is what we're working on, this is what we have coming for tomorrow, is the way that you keep tabs on yourself and make sure that the whole organization knows what you're working on and isn't doing the exact same thing.
That's a good lesson for all of us. Alex, thank you. It's been such a pleasure and a real privilege to have you here with us at Columbia. We wish we could have done this in person, but one of these days when life resumes, we'll have to extend the invite again. Thanks for making time for us, and we hope you stay safe and healthy out there. Any parting words that I don't want to interrupt you from being able to say?
No, nothing really. Just thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. This was great. I wish we could have been in person, but I do want you all to know that I did change out of a hoodie just for you. For journalism.
You're very lucky. And I put on this sweater, and
yeah, no,
that's a big effort. Yep. All right. Take care. All the best. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.
Bye.